Please enjoy this original recording of the Mini Bible College, also known as MBC, hosted by the author himself, Pastor Dick Woodward, in the 1980s. International Cooperating Ministries is privileged to make his timeless Bible lessons available. Each weekly episode is 30 minutes. Together, these sessions create a 3-year curriculum. This practical walk through the Bible is nurturing believers and equipping disciples speaking 31 languages in more than 50,000 small group Bible studies around the world. Now, here's Pastor Woodward with the Mini Bible College.
This is the message that came to the prophet Habakkuk in a vision from God. O Lord, how long must I call for help before you will listen? I shout to you in vain, there is no answer. Help, murder, I cry, but no one comes to save. Must I forever see this sin and sadness all around me? Wherever I look, there is oppression and bribery and men who love to argue and to fight. The law is not enforced, and there's no justice given in the courts, for the wicked far outnumber the righteous, and bribes and trickery prevail. The Lord replied, Look and be amazed. You will be astounded at what I'm about to do, for I'm going to do something in your lifetime that you will have to see to believe. I'm raising up a new force on the world scene, the Chaldeans, a cruel and violent nation who will march across the world and conquer it. They are notorious for their cruelty. They do as they like, and no one can interfere. Their horses are swifter than leopards. They are a fierce people, more fierce than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry move proudly forward from a distant land. Like eagles, they come swooping down to pounce upon their prey. All opposition melts away before the terror of their presence. O Lord, my God, my Holy One, you who are eternal, is your plan in all of this to wipe us out? Surely not. O God, our rock, you have decreed the rise of these Chaldeans to chasten and correct us for our awful sins. We are wicked, but they are far more. Will you, who cannot allow sin in any form, stand idly by while they swallow us up? Should you be silent while the wicked destroy those who are better than they? Are we but fish to be caught and killed? Are we but creeping things that have no leader to defend them from their foes? Must we be strung up on their hooks and dragged out in their nets while they rejoice? I will climb my watchtower now and wait to see what answer God will give me to my complaint. And the Lord said to me, Write my answer on a billboard, large and clear, so that anyone can read it at a glance. Slowly, steadily, surely, the time approaches when the vision will be fulfilled. If it seems slow, do not despair, for these things will surely come to pass. Just be patient. They will not be overdue a single day. Note this. Wicked men trust themselves alone, as these Babylonians do, and fail. But the righteous man trusts in me and lives. What's more, these arrogant Chaldeans are betrayed by all their wine, for it is treacherous. In their greed they have collected many nations, but like death and hell, they are never satisfied. This is the way the prophecy of Habakkuk begins. Habakkuk has been called the agnostic prophet, or he has been called the prophet who has a question mark for a brain. It would seem that Habakkuk is asking questions, asking questions, asking questions. Somebody showed me a cartoon once where a census taker was at the door and the man was answering the door, and the man said to the census taker, he was sort of a hippie type, and he said to the census taker, I just have questions, man, just questions, no answers. Well, many people feel that that's Habakkuk, the man with the questions but no answers. Now, I really identify with this prophet Habakkuk because when I was younger and in college and seminary, I had a question mark for a brain. In fact, I was asked not to continue in the seminary where I trained because I had so many questions. I had a question mark for a brain. I always loved Habakkuk because it seemed to me when I got to the prophet Habakkuk, here was a man who sure had a lot of questions. And he didn't seem to be penalized for his questions. In fact, God really meets this man because of his questions. Now, Habakkuk, if you get a historical perspective on him, is an exception to this concept that we've mentioned before. He's an exception to the rule that the prophets are not found in chronological order. he comes right after the book of Nahum, and that means that he's in chronological order because he lives right after Nineveh falls to the Medes and the Babylonians as prophesied by Nahum. Assyria is no longer the world power, Babylon is, but Habakkuk knows that just as soon as these Babylonians are finished with Nineveh, they're turning toward Jerusalem and they're going to Jerusalem. You see, the prophets had told the people of God, prophets like Nahum, you don't have to worry about Assyria anymore. But that isn't what the prophets had told them about Babylon, was it? All these prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah and so many of them, they said, you're going to be conquered by the Babylonians and you're going to be taken into captivity by the Babylonians, and 70 years later you're going to come back from that captivity. So the people of God who knew the will of God and the Word of God, they knew the Babylonians were coming. And Habakkuk knows that just as soon as the Babylonians and the Medes are through conquering Nineveh, they're coming to Jerusalem. Now, he is a contemporary then with Jeremiah. He's probably living at the time that Jehoiakim was the king there in Jerusalem. He was the king who surrendered the city of Jerusalem for the first time. This means that he also lived and ministered during the revival under good King Josiah, and he was contemporary probably with Daniel. He's living in Jerusalem at a time when they know that the first horde of Babylonians is coming to conquer the city. Now here is the historical climate in which this man lives and preaches his great sermon. Jeremiah, of course, lived at the same time, and Jeremiah was preaching, remember, during this period, and his preaching was so unpopular. When he said that the Babylonians were coming, the people hated him. Remember, we said it was only a quotation from Micah that saved Jeremiah's life. The people were so determined to kill him because he said Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. Now Habakkuk knows that if he preaches the message God wants him to preach at this time, he's going to be persecuted too. In fact, he probably feels he'll be persecuted more because he wasn't even a prophet. Habakkuk was a choir director. Habakkuk was a Levite choir master. You know, in 1 Chronicles 23, we're told that David divided up the priesthood into courses, and when he did that, 4,000 of these Levites did nothing but play on instruments which David had made to praise the Lord with. And when we took up the book of Psalms and surveyed it, we said that many of the Psalms were written by these Levites who were full-time professional musicians or singers. They were composers of sacred music. They wrote some of the Psalms. They wrote hymns and chants and things that were used in the worship. Well, Habakkuk was one of them. Now put yourself in Habakkuk's shoes. He is living at the same time that Jeremiah lives. God gives him a message. Jeremiah's probably in the dungeon and can't be preaching. And Habakkuk, I think, figures this out. If I get up and preach this, man, they'll really nail me to the wall. And so I believe Habakkuk, as an artist, as a musician, as a creative person, comes up with a tremendous literary form for preaching his message. I think it's just beautiful. You might say that the book of Habakkuk is the original talk show. You might say that Habakkuk kind of has a talk show with God. This is really what he does. He says to the people who are scared to death and just living in terror, when the watchtowers are manned and they're listening for the sounds and looking for the signs of the Babylonian army, he says to them, you know, I know you have questions on your heart. I have questions on my heart that I'd like to ask God. Like, for instance, God, why are you doing nothing when you know disaster's coming? Why are you going to use a people more wicked than we are to punish us? Why? He asks all these questions. Now, frankly, this is just my own theory about Habakkuk. I don't believe Habakkuk was the agnostic prophet. I don't believe he was the man with the questions. I believe he was the man with the answers. Kenneth Strachan, a great missionary statesman, said, preachers are always scratching people where they don't itch and answering questions nobody's asking. Well, I don't believe that was true of Habakkuk. I believe Habakkuk not only knew the questions the people were asking, and he not only asked those questions, he answered those questions. And that's the point to his whole prophecy. Now, the literary form of Habakkuk, I think, is very unique. I had an opportunity to be on commercial television for 10 years, and the reason why we were on was because we had a dialogue with a person. There was a person who had a talk show for 26 years in a local area. It was like a household word in that area. And we just happened to be interviewed on that show the day before Christmas. And we got along so well in this dialogue that we were invited back eventually once a week to have a Bible study in a talk show context or format. And one day the woman with whom we had this talk show was ill. And I thought, now I'm going to get a chance to preach because there's nobody here but me. And I thought this would really be great. But they made me do the show with the weatherman. And I was kind of disappointed that I didn't get my chance to go solo. And so I played tennis with the weatherman frequently. And the next time I was playing tennis with him, he was also the director of the show. I asked him, I said, why wouldn't they let me go solo when the host of the talk show was sick? And he said, oh, the talking head, man, the talking head. And I said, I beg your pardon? He said, you know, a talking head. He said, nobody listens to a talking head. If you come on just talking, just you, well, people will hit the button and turn it off because they don't watch a talking head. You've got to have more than one person. You've got to have dialogue and 3 cameras, and you show this person, then you show that person, then you show both of them together, and you show the whole room, and you have to break it up like that. And they couldn't let you go solo. Well, frankly, I believe a long, long time ago, Habakkuk knew that nobody wants to hear a talking head. And I think Habakkuk discovered, you know, this art form that is so popular today, the talk show, the dialogue. Only the talk show hosted by Habakkuk was with God. You see, what Habakkuk said, and it's so clever, I think, to these people was this, and they didn't stone him for it or throw him in a dungeon. He said, you're up in your watchtowers and you're watching for the Babylonians and listening for the Babylonians. Let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to build a spiritual watchtower, and I'm going up in that spiritual watchtower, and I'm going to watch for God. And I'm going to ask God all of my questions. He's God. He's got the answers. I'm just going to pour my heart out to him and ask him all my questions. And then I'm going to sit up there in that spiritual watchtower, and I'm going to listen until God answers my questions. And I'm going to wait until God answers my questions. And I'm going to watch until God answers my questions. Well, I think that was a very clever approach to preaching. And then sure enough, at a later time, Habakkuk says, he's answered me. Let me tell you what the answers are. Because when he asked the questions there in his spiritual watchtower, he asked the questions that were on the hearts of these people. They were all asking those questions. Now, when he got the answer from God, there were many answers, but the answer that really helped him was in chapter 2, verse 4 of his prophecy. And this is where we get one of the greatest verses in the Bible. This verse is quoted 3 times in the New Testament. This is where we get the quote, the just shall live by faith. When God answered Habakkuk in this dialogue that they had, this was the answer of God. First, God's answer had to do with the enemy, the Babylonians. God said to Habakkuk, the Babylonians are crooked in their heart. Their mindset is wrong. They're arrogant, they're cruel, they live by the sword. That's going to be their undoing. They're going to die by the sword. They're going to be destroyed, and the seeds of their destruction is in their own heart because their heart isn't right. That was his message about the Babylonians. But then God also had a message in his answer to Habakkuk for the people of God. He said the Babylonians will destroy themselves because the seeds of their destruction, their undoing, is in themselves. But my people, the just, shall live by faith. Now this was good news because it was confirming the preaching of Jeremiah and Isaiah that they were going to come back from captivity. The just are going to live if they just have faith. Maybe he meant faith in the preaching of Isaiah and Jeremiah. The people of God had already heard the good news about the return from the captivity. Maybe that's what God is alluding to when he says, my people, the just, shall live, and they'll live by faith. Now that's really good news at this time because, as we say, it confirms and affirms the preaching of Isaiah and Jeremiah. Now, frankly, that's the message of Habakkuk. I believe that's the real message of Habakkuk. Now, there are some other garden spots, you might call them, in the book of Habakkuk, and they come to us, in this context of what we have called the talk show or the dialogue between Habakkuk and God. The real garden spot of the book of Habakkuk, which is quoted in Romans 1:17 and Hebrews 10:38 and Galatians 3:11, is this statement: the just shall live by faith. One morning Martin Luther was having his devotions in the Latin Bible, and as he was wrestling with many, many problems, he came to Romans 1:17, where it says, the just shall live by faith, quoting Habakkuk. And Luther wrote in the margin of his Bible, sole, alone. And God so touched his heart that morning in his quiet time that this little verse, the just shall live by faith, brought about what we call the Protestant Reformation. There was a Reformation, and all your Protestant denominations grow out of that Reformation because of a quotation in the New Testament of this answer God gave to Habakkuk: the just shall live by faith, not by works, not by attainment or accomplishment or achievement, not by penance or indulgence, but by faith. That's what it meant to Luther. Now, in a sense, what God was saying to Habakkuk was, Habakkuk, you accused me of doing nothing, but I want you to know I'm in charge, and I am doing something. The Babylonians will be destroyed, they will be their own undoing, and my people will live by faith. Now, the application, of course, to this watchtower of Habakkuk's, and it's very, very important, I believe, is this. When you have problems, like Babylon-type problems, I know you've probably never been a prisoner of war or taken off into captivity, most of you, but you do have crises. When you have a Babylon-type crisis, what should you do? According to the example of Habakkuk, you should build your spiritual watchtower, and you should go up there in that spiritual watchtower, figuratively speaking, and you should just tell God about this crisis and ask Him all your questions. You should listen there in your watchtower until you hear God tell you how He's working in your life through that problem, through that crisis. You should wait there in your watchtower until God shows you how He's working in your life through that crisis. You should watch there in your watchtower until you can see the God who's working in your life and how He's working in your life. Now, when that happens, then see and worship the God who's working in your life. I believe the book of Habakkuk is encouraging us to ask our questions, but it's doing more than that. It's encouraging us to listen to God. Dr. G. Campbell Morgan, a great Bible scholar from England, made this statement about the book of Habakkuk. Having commented on the entire book, he said, people say that God doesn't speak to men today the way He did in Habakkuk's time. But Dr. Morgan said it would be more accurate to say men do not listen to God today as they did in Habakkuk's time. Have you ever noticed the emphasis in the Scripture upon listening to God? You see, prayer is a conversation with God, and a conversation has two dimensions. There are two parts to every conversation. Maybe you haven't discovered this yet. But in a conversation, one part of the conversation is when you're speaking to that other person, and the other part of the conversation is when that other person is speaking to you. If you're known as a good conversationalist, it's probably because you're a good listener. People will say that you're a good conversationalist, meaning that you listen when they speak. Now, coming back to this prophecy of Habakkuk, this is the real message, I believe, by devotional application of this beautiful little book. It's a spiritual and literary jewel, in my opinion. What Habakkuk is saying to us is, listen. Listen for God until God can tell you how He's working in your life. And then you wait for God, and you watch for God in your spiritual watchtower until He shows you how He's working in your life. If you'll do that, like Habakkuk, you may begin with despair and with fear, but you'll end up singing. One of the garden spots in the book of Habakkuk is chapter 3. There are 3 chapters in Habakkuk, as in many of these small prophets. And in chapter 1, when he begins with his questions, he's despairing, he's in fear and terror, and he's what they call the agnostic prophet. He's just all questions. But when God answers him in chapter 2, notice how chapter 3 ends. Chapter 3 is a hymn that's composed by Habakkuk. He wrote a hymn. And at the end of that hymn, he says, a note to the choir director. When singing this, the choir is to be accompanied by string instruments. See, he's not kidding. He's really a professional musician. He's written a hymn. He even tells them how he wants the accompaniment to be, because that's what he is. He's a musician. He's an author, a composer of sacred music. But the important thing about the book is this. He begins with a sigh of despair. But when he builds the watchtower and listens and waits and watches for God, he ends up singing. He ends up singing a hymn. And that hymn that he sings at the end of the book is so beautiful. You see, we don't know what happened to Habakkuk. When Jerusalem fell, he might have been put to death. He might have been taken off in chains. He might not have survived the captivity. That's not the important thing. History doesn't tell us what happened to this man. But the thing that is important about Habakkuk is this. When he writes that hymn at the end of the book, he says, even though the fig trees are all destroyed, and there is neither blossom left nor fruit, and though the olive crops all fail and the fields lie barren, even if the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be happy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he will give me the speed of a deer and bring me safely over the mountains. One of the beautiful things about the Old Testament saints is their commitment to God. In the book of Daniel, when his 3 friends are threatened with the fiery furnace because they won't bow down to the image of Nebuchadnezzar, they say to Nebuchadnezzar, our God is able to deliver us from your fiery furnace, but he may not. But whether he does or not, we will not bow down to your image. You see, they don't know for sure that it's going to have a happy ending. So many of these stories have a happy ending. Many of them didn't have a happy ending, but they died anyway. The word witness in the original Greek is the word martos, M-A-R-T-O-S. And if you really understand that a witness is a martyr, because a witness will die for his lifestyle, for his value system. His purpose is not to be healthy or comfortable or free or alive. His purpose is to show the world a witness. And for that witness, he will lay down his life. That's what a witness is. That's what the root meaning of the word actually is. Now, Habakkuk's a witness. And in a very clever art form, I think he's showing these people through his dialogue with God, I believe he's showing them some answers, and he's showing them some direction, and he's showing them how to turn their sigh of despair and all their question marks into a song. And when you get into that song with which he ends his book, he's unconditionally committed to God, whether God bails him out or not. And I think that's beautiful, that hymn of Habakkuk with which he closes his book. Well, some other good parts to the book of Habakkuk are, in chapter 3, when he's got his solution, notice that this prophet who accuses God of doing nothing, when he sees that God is going to cross over someday to that other side of his character and express his wrath toward Babylon as he did toward the Assyrians and Nineveh, he prays this prayer, in wrath remember mercy. What he's really saying is when God gives him a vision of what's going to happen to the Babylonians, oh God, have mercy on them. In Psalm 73, the psalmist Asaph has the problem that he envies the wicked, and he takes that problem into the sanctuary. And when he goes into the sanctuary there in Psalm 73, God lets Asaph spend about 5 minutes in hell. You know, if we could spend 5 minutes in hell or 5 minutes in heaven, I think it would have a profound effect upon us. We'd probably get a flatbed truck and a tent and boxes or barrels full of sawdust and go across the country and have evangelistic crusades if we could spend 5 minutes in hell. Asaph spent 5 minutes in hell. God showed him the end of the wicked, and his emotion toward the wicked changed from one of envy to one of pity, and he prays for the wicked. Well, that happens to Habakkuk too. And he says, in wrath remember mercy. And then here's another great verse that comes out of Habakkuk, out of this beautiful forum. The Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before him. Have you ever heard the choir sing that at the beginning of the worship service? little church I grew up in Western Pennsylvania had a plaque at the front of the church, and it had those words on it: "Let all the earth keep silence before him, because the Lord is in his holy temple." We had a special speaker who came to our church one time, and he had a big chart, and he was showing us biblical prophecy and the end of the world and all these things that are illustrated by charts. And to illustrate his chart, he was an eccentric man. He had a fishing rod with a reflector on the end of the fishing rod, and he would point to the chart with this fishing rod with the reflector on it. And if the children talked in the front rows, he would just rap them over the head with that fishing rod. And I got rapped right between the horns with that fishing rod one time, and he pointed to that sign: "The Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before him." Well, bless his heart, I'm sure he's in heaven now, and when I get to heaven, I want to straighten him out. That's not really what that verse means. That's not what Habakkuk is really saying. You see, what Habakkuk is saying is, this is not a verse, keep quiet because church is going to start. What he's saying is, God is in his holy temple, and if you've got problems, just be silent. Just be quiet before him. Be still and know that he's God. And ask him your questions, and then listen for his answers. That's really what Habakkuk was saying. Now, like all the other prophets, Habakkuk ends with an upbeat, and he says, when he talks about the restoration after the captivity, "For the earth will be filled with the glory of God like the waters cover the sea." Have you ever heard that quote? That's from Habakkuk, and that has his restoration message in it. And then he gives us his rationale for the deliverance that's sure to come by saying this: "You came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one." After all, one of the most important purposes of these chosen people is they are the people through whom the Messiah is going to come into the world. Remember when Jesus was crossing the Sea of Galilee in that little boat and the storm came up? He was asleep on a pillow, and the apostles came rushing back, and they said, "Don't you know we're all going to drown? We're all going to perish?" And he said, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Well, what did he mean? Well, the hymn writer put it this way: "No ocean can swallow the ship where lies the master of ocean and earth and skies." If he really was who he was telling them that he was, then how in the world could they all perish in a storm? Well, the same thing could be said for the people of God in the Old Testament. They couldn't be completely destroyed. They could not be completely wiped out. The northern kingdom is wiped out by the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom is going into Babylonian captivity, but they have to come back. There has to be an upbeat. There has to be a happy ending to that captivity story, because the anointed one is going to come through them. And the rationale for the deliverance of these people from their captivity is, you came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. Well, just remember, the message of Habakkuk has to do with that watchtower. I wonder, have you ever built a watchtower? When Jesus met Nathanael, he was the one of the apostles who was holy. And Jesus really proved himself to Nathanael, because Nathanael apparently had devotions under a fig tree, and nobody knew about it except Nathanael. And when Jesus said, "There's an Israelite in whom there is no guile," Nathanael said, "How do you know me?" And Jesus said, "I'm the one you've been talking to under the fig tree." And Nathanael said, "You're the Son of God, you're the King of Israel." You might call that the fellowship of the fig tree. See, Nathanael, he communed with God under that fig tree. That's the same thing as the watchtower. Do you have a fig tree where you meet with God? Do you have a watchtower where you wait and listen for God?
For more information on the Mini Bible College, please visit www.minibiblecollege.org or call 1-800-999-3892. International Cooperating Ministries is located at 1901 North Armistead Avenue in Hampton, Virginia.